In a recent episode discussing the memorable weirdness of Final Fantasy VII's Emerald Weapon, I made a passing reference to how the creature represented a certain endgame sadness for me whenever I reach it. It's a feeling I've considered making an episode on for a while now, and since it's a comment that seemed to resonate with some, today we consider why certain games, and often in particular Final Fantasy endgames, elicit such a feeling of sadness, what emotive and mechanistic features of the games are triggered, and what have more recent titles and genres attempted to do to address and remedy this. Jumping right in, I'm firstly in many ways relieved to find that endgame depression isn't something that is particular to my experience of Final Fantasy, and as someone who has 20-year-old memory cards that are basically just graveyards of Final Fantasy endgame scenarios, loading up to show our heroes idling beside an airship at level 99, just waiting to cross the Rubicon to the final dungeon, I often find myself unwilling and unable to go ahead and complete reruns of a Final Fantasy, not because of some innate laziness to trawl back through a final dungeon, but actually because of some inherent denial about wanting this adventure to end. So what is it that hits here? What is this reluctance to bring it home and earn the credit roll that is normally the point and purpose of such a game? It's not a reluctance that I feel echoed in other titles that I hold in high regard, whether that's Metal Gear Solid or Tekken, for example. So let's drill down and really look at why Final Fantasies and comparable RPGs result in this. So, starting with structure and design, Final Fantasies are games that from the outset of the series have worked in a pseudo-open world formula that rewards the player by gradually opening up as the story progresses. They have strategically designed topography, which means we can only fully traverse the world with improving modes of transport like airships. So by the final third of the game we are free to explore the world without hindrance, and it's where the games usually fully open out most completely in a really what is actually a fleeting moment that in a sense can stretch out for as long as we want it to, where we are free to backtrack and explore everything, travel anywhere. And it's here we can discover secrets, unlock ultimate weapons and equipment, and generally make the most of exploring, unlocking and obtaining things in this suddenly accessible world. And this is the very mechanistic or gameplay-centric angle of this bittersweet freedom, where, for example, if we want to acquire Eden or Knights of the Round summons or unlock the Lionheart or Ultima weapon, this is the time to do it in most respective games. And if we suppose a Final Fantasy game of the golden era is about 40 hours average playtime, a good quarter of this time might be spent in this final 3 roaming stanza. And equally scaling up to more recent games, if we suppose they're about 60 hours of average game time. Likewise, probably a good quarter of this can be spent focusing on ancillary side content, leveling up, finding items and so on. So it's a prime example, I think, of how the games mechanistically diverge, and indeed how the genre of RPG is unique from aforementioned story-driven titles like Metal Gear Solid, which, while equally fantastic and a series that I love, it tends to track very closely to the espionage action, the plot progression and the story there, rather than throwing the ball back into the player's court in the end game, allowing them to free roam and explore. So part of this pang of sadness then comes uniquely to games like Final Fantasy, when there are essentially no more unlockables to obtain, no more monsters to slay, and as a recent comment on the channel aptly suggested, there are no more worlds to conquer, in that excellent adage to Alexander the Great by celebrated philosopher Hans Gruber. And so, much like my references to Emerald Weapon, this weighty sadness descends and a profound emptiness is felt when there isn't much left to do in the world. The player characters can't really move the dial anymore by acquiring things or altering things or interacting with things. Visiting towns or engaging with NPCs tends to stagnate. The dialogues remain the same, they don't change with any context or narrative progression because there's none left to do. And so the only real direction to go in is towards that final dungeon. So that's the mechanistic and structural side of things, this incentive to explore. But I think the more subtle and emotive aspect of the endgame, and this emptiness that accompanies it, comes, I think, from the characters and indeed the world that we have been immersed in. Now, even by the standards of today, 30 to 40 hours of gameplay is a fair amount of time investment, and even more so with more recent 50 to 60 hour playthroughs. This is time we have spent immersed in a very rich fantasy world, looking at some of the social political machinations of that world, and most importantly, I think, becoming emotionally invested in the party of characters that we meet along the way. And these parasocial or pseudo-social relationships that we've forged naturally create genuine emotional connection. We care about the plight of Vivi or Cloud Strife, Renoa and Squall. We care about the friends that they make, and this motley network of comrades who support one another and become inseparable by the end game. And yet, bittersweetly, it is always at the strongest, most fulfilled peak of this fellowship quest, where the bonds between the characters have been so irrefutably forged that we inevitably have to leave them. So this short-lived glimpse of the Final Fantasy VII team aboard the Highwind together, espousing their world-saving dialogues, or seeing Zidane, Garnet, Steiner and Beatrix, or comparably Squall and Renoa on the balcony in FF8, Zell with his hot dogs in the ballroom. These closing moments where emotional relationships have been fulfilled, while undoubtedly heartwarming and fulfilling, they are also the handing off point between the player and the game, and it's a farewell to the friends that we've made in these weighty adventures. This is doubly impactful with most Final Fantasies because, of course, they were intended and originally designed as standalone titles, which was an ethos that was very much enforced by Hironobu Sakaguchi. And so by having these self-contained stories, self-contained character arcs and worlds, it made the goodbye that much more weighty for emotionally invested players. Looking to other games and design patterns that have attempted to prevent or offset this hard goodbye and the feeling of emptiness that fills these otherwise open worlds, there's been a few interesting attempts to prolong game experiences as games mature over the years. A notable one, I think, is the Radiant AI, or the Radiant Quest system that Bethesda developed for the Elder Scrolls games, and this essentially attempted to create an infinite, self-perpetuating loop of quest lines that prolonged the lived experience in the game world. The shortcomings here were, of course, that the quests were limited essentially to fetch quests, which created a very short-lived and diminishing returns for that game, and most audiences seem to really loathe fetch quests. They are quite a cheap sort of filler, sort of side quest mechanic. But as an aside, I do think the prospects for AI in game design in the future could make inroads in this area of dynamic and procedurally generating quests becoming more of a thing. Although personally, I am someone that really likes games that eventually end, and I am also someone that likes a shared experience of games, even one-player games like Final Fantasy, because for discussions like this, we all have a shared experience of these touch points of a game. When you move into dynamic content, obviously it becomes much more variable, perhaps a topic for another day. Moving on, another way that games try to prolong life, which Final Fantasy has increasingly adopted in recent years, is the New Game Plus feature. And this is basically replaying the game in a same but different fashion. It can result in additional unlockables, and it usually allows you to retain your level and equipment. But oddly, I think this is where other games, and often action games, platformers or fighting games, have historically moved the dial and had an interesting edge with how they handle what is essentially a New Game Plus sort of completion. So as a Tekken fan, I know fighting games are very different, but they traditionally had unlockable sub-bosses, unlockable secret characters, which you could then play through the game, earn endings with, and unlock new characters with. So that was quite interesting. Also, Tenchu Wrath of Heaven as just one example, and also I think one of the unsung heroes of the PlayStation 2 era as a game experience. Tenchu Wrath of Heaven was really interesting in how it offered slightly dynamic playthroughs of essentially the same story, because you had two core characters, and then you had a third playthrough style with an unlockable character. So although you are going through the same stages of the game, you have a slightly different experience, slightly different cutscenes, and slightly different play styles with these respective characters. So that's how replayability has historically succeeded in certain genres and other game titles. Gradually it has been eroded over the years, certainly the last decade, thanks to DLC packs for unlockables rather than rewards earned by actually playing the game. And regardless, these aren't nearly as applicable to a game like a Final Fantasy adventure, because the stories are so carefully structured and crafted around a defined hero, a defined party of characters. So having unlockable characters naturally doesn't quite make sense there. So there we have it, a very brief look at the bittersweet endgame experience that Final Fantasy tends to have. Something that I recently experienced having successive playthroughs of Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy VII, where I am just sat around mastering materia because I really don't want to finish the game. And I find this really quite an interesting and profound sort of a emotive reaction. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you'd like to buy me a coffee, that would be lovely. The links are available below.